Most people know how Chernobyl exploded, but almost no one knows what the Soviets did next. In the days after the Chernobyl disaster, a secret mission took shape high above the burning reactor. Soviet Tu-6 bombers, normally used for long-range strikes, were suddenly assigned a new and urgent purpose: to make it rain. The operation was overseen by Yuri Israel, head of the Soviet State Committee of Hydrometeorology. 2 days after Reactor 4 exploded, a classified weather map landed on his desk. It showed a radioactive cloud drifting directly toward Moscow, with millions of people at risk in the capital preparing for its annual May Day parade, a celebration that could never be canceled without shaming the Soviet government. Israel gave a chilling order: make it rain before the cloud reached the city. Just 48 hours after the explosion, the operation began. At a Moscow airbase, artillery shells packed with silver iodide were loaded into Tu-6 bombers. The crews lifted off into the dark sky, their mission simple but perilous: intercept the radioactive clouds and force them to drop their poison before reaching Moscow. At first, the bombers circled the shattered plant within a 6-mile radius, but the wind pushed the toxic plume farther and farther away, forcing the pilots to chase it for hundreds of miles. When they finally caught up, they fired the silver iodide into the clouds. The particles acted like tiny ice crystals, drawing moisture together until the sky broke open. In the village of Narvi, just 30 miles north of Chernobyl, people watched the heavens darken. Strange yellow and gray contrails twisted above them, and by 8 that evening, the clouds burst apart. Thunder rolled across the land as black rain poured down in torrents, washing radioactive dust from the air and driving it deep into the soil. Weather modification wasn't new to the Soviet Air Force. Since 1941, they had experimented with ways to bend nature to their will. By the 1980 Moscow Olympics, the same Tu-6 bombers had been used to clear the skies for the Games. But this new operation, codenamed Cyclone, was unlike anything before. The rain they created carried more than water. It brought a deadly cocktail of radioactive isotopes: cesium-137, iodine-131, and others. The storms dumped their fallout across Belarus, sparing Moscow, but drowning entire villages in invisible poison. Meanwhile, in Ukraine, another weather experiment took shape, this time with the opposite goal. Pilots from the Institute of Hydrometeorology, flying unarmed civilian planes, were ordered not to make it rain, but to stop the rain entirely. Thunderstorms were spreading radiation into the Pripyat River, one of Ukraine's main water sources. To halt them, pilots released tons of a chemical mixture known as Cement 600, a blend of cement powder and drying agents meant to choke moisture from the air. The strange operation worked too well. It stopped the rain and triggered a 5-month drought across parts of Ukraine. By winter 1986, both missions had achieved their objective. Moscow had been spared, but the cost was devastating. The villages drenched in radioactive rain saw their radiation levels rise 20 to 30 times higher than normal. Entire communities were poisoned. Children fell ill. Cancer rates skyrocketed. Birth defects became common. For years, the Soviet government denied that any of it had ever happened. But in the silent countryside of Belarus, the truth lingered. In the soil, in the rivers, and in the generations born beneath that black rain. The storm that saved millions had cursed thousands. For the people below those clouds, the rain that saved Moscow would become a curse written into their blood. The summer of 1990 was unbearably hot in Ukraine. In a remote railway yard in the northern town of Pisa, a line of broken refrigerated train cars stood motionless behind barbed wire. Inside them lay a cargo almost as deadly as the reactor's own debris: 317 tons of radioactive meat, sealed and forgotten. It wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a larger Soviet plan to deal with the aftermath of Chernobyl, by quietly spreading the contamination far and wide. After Reactor 4 exploded, life around Chernobyl collapsed overnight. 50,000 head of livestock were seized from the exclusion zone, not to be buried, but to be slaughtered. The authorities had a grim strategy. The most contaminated meat would be mixed with clean stock in factories across Ukraine and Belarus. turned into sausages and sent out for sale. The logic was simple and horrifying. Dilute the radiation and no one would notice. Ordinary citizens would eat the disaster itself. Only Moscow and Leningrad, the elite Soviet cities, were spared the tainted food. In the meatpacking plants, conditions were brutal. Radiation monitors, barely trained and poorly equipped, walked between hanging carcasses, their Geiger counters clicking wildly. Workers toiled beneath the constant hum of machinery, surrounded by invisible danger, processing animal after animal to keep up with demand. Cows had grazed on radioactive fields. Now their flesh carried the fallout into the food chain. By the end of 1987, the system was collapsing. Cold storage facilities were overflowing with contaminated meat that exceeded every safety limit. At the Gal meat factory in Belarus, managers faced an impossible choice: destroy the stock or move it elsewhere. Desperate, they loaded 4 refrigerated train cars with the toxic cargo and sent them south, hoping to dump it in the Republic of Georgia. Georgia refused the shipment immediately, but that was only the beginning. For the next 4 years, the meat train rolled endlessly across the Soviet rail network, rejected at every stop at each station. Local officials approached with Geiger counters, scanned the cars, and turned them away. And so the radioactive cargo wandered from yard to yard, unwanted and unclaimed, a ghost on steel tracks. By 1990, the refrigeration units had failed. The KGB took over the case. The train sat in the already contaminated north of Ukraine. But even then, railway workers refused to repair it. No one dared touch the cursed freight. Finally, the KGB ordered the train to be moved to a remote region of Belarus. There, a deep cement-lined trench was dug, and the meat, still radioactive, was buried underground. That single train, along with thousands of tons of other contaminated produce, symbolized the Soviet Union's final attempt to hide what couldn't be controlled. Some tragedies, it turned out, could never be buried. But the fallout from Chernobyl didn't stop at the Soviet border. It drifted thousands of miles across Europe, poisoning lands no one had imagined. In Swedish Lapland, photographer Robert Del Tredici documented a chilling sight: a makeshift freezer filled with radioactive reindeer. Scientists later estimated that Chernobyl released over 400 times more radioactive material than the Hiroshima bomb. 80% of Sweden's reindeer population was contaminated by a single passing cloud carrying just 2 pounds, 0.9 kilograms, of cesium-137. As the fallout settled into the forests and lakes, it seeped into everything alive. The green lichen that the reindeer fed on absorbed the isotopes directly from the air, acting like a sponge for the poison. The animals kept eating, and one by one, they became toxic themselves. For the Sami people, who had lived in Lapland for nearly 9,000 years, herding reindeer was not just survival, it was identity. Chernobyl shattered that world. The meat from their herds was too radioactive to eat or sell. The authorities ordered it to be dyed blue and buried in vast nuclear waste pits deep in the tundra. Faced with impossible restrictions and generations of work undone, many Sami herders freed their animals and walked away. A culture that had survived for millennia was suddenly forced to vanish into history. Think this was the worst of Chernobyl? The truth gets darker, only on the Unknown Files.